The stadium lights in Paris burned with an intensity that felt almost unreal as Sydney McLaughlin Levrone crossed the line in 50.37 seconds. A moment that redefined what the human body could achieve in the 400-meter hurdles. The world watched history being rewritten in real time, but behind that historic finish was a story that did not begin with victory. It began years earlier with pressure, expectation, and a question that followed her long before she ever became a world record holder. How did the most dominant athlete in track and field emerge from one of the biggest disappointments of her life? To understand that answer, you have to go back to a time when Sydney was not yet a champion, but a teenage sensation carrying the weight of an entire sport on her shoulders. Before Paris, before Tokyo, before the records, she was a young athlete from the United States who had already been labeled as the future of track and field. Every race she entered came with expectation, not just of winning, but of redefining what was possible. At just 16 years old, she achieved something most athletes spend a lifetime chasing. She qualified for the United States Olympic team in the 400-meter hurdles, stepping onto one of the most competitive stages in global sport while still a high school student. It was not just rare, it was historic. A teenager standing shoulder to shoulder with the best athletes in the country, proving that her talent was not potential anymore. It was already reality. The attention that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Experts spoke about her as a once-in-a-generation talent. Fans followed every race, every split, every improvement in her technique. She was not simply winning races, she was breaking age group records and running times that placed her among the fastest women in the world. Regardless of age, the future, in the eyes of many, already belonged to her. Leading into the Rio Olympics, the expectations had reached a level that rarely falls on someone so young. She was seen not just as a participant, but as a potential finalist, maybe even a medal contender. Her rapid rise in the 400-meter hurdles had created a belief that she was already ahead of schedule, already stepping into greatness before most athletes had even fully developed. But beneath that excitement was a quieter reality. She was still a teenager, learning how to handle pressure that most seasoned professionals struggle with. Every race became a test of not only speed, but composure. Every step toward Rio carried the invisible weight of comparison, prediction, and global attention that did not pause for age or experience. The performances that brought her to the Olympic stage were already historic for someone her age. She had run times that placed her among elite senior athletes, and she had done it while still competing at the high school level. That combination of youth and world-class ability created a narrative that felt almost unstoppable. It seemed like only a matter of time before she would take over the sport completely. As the Olympic Games in Rio approached, the story was no longer about whether she was good enough. It was about how quickly she would rise. The world expected the beginning of a dynasty, a young athlete stepping into the Olympic spotlight and immediately confirming everything people had been saying about her future. Instead, Rio delivered something very different. At the Rio 2016 Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro, Sydney McLaughlin arrived as one of the youngest athletes in track and field, carrying a level of attention that far exceeded her age. The Olympic environment felt different from anything she had experienced before, where every movement was watched and every expectation felt heavier than the last. For a 16-year-old stepping onto the world stage, the pressure was not just external, it was constant and overwhelming. In the opening round of the 400-meter hurdles, she ran with calm control that reflected her preparation and natural rhythm. She advanced safely to the next round, and for a brief moment, it seemed the Olympic experience would match the expectations built around her. The semi-final carried a completely different level of intensity, where the pace was sharper and the margin for error almost disappeared. Sydney ran with determination, but the race demanded perfection from the first hurdle to the last. When the semi-final ended, the result confirmed that she would not advance to the final. The margins were small, but in Olympic competition, small differences decide everything. The contrast between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. Before Rio, she had been described as a future Olympic medal contender, but the race itself showed how demanding the highest level truly was. The story that had surrounded her suddenly shifted as attention moved toward established finalists and medal contenders. From an objective standpoint, reaching the Olympic stage at 16 was a remarkable achievement that very few athletes ever accomplish. But the emotional reality was different, because expectations had already placed her in a position where anything short of the final felt incomplete. The gap between achievement and expectation created a feeling that was difficult to process. For Sydney, the disappointment was not defined by a complete collapse, but by the space between what was expected and what actually happened. She had proven she belonged at the Olympic level, yet the performance did not match the narrative that had surrounded her. In that space, uncertainty began to grow about the direction of her future in the sport. After Rio, the certainty that had surrounded her future began to fade. The path that once looked inevitable now felt open and uncertain. She had experienced the highest level of sport, but the result had forced a pause in the narrative that many had already written for her. It was no longer about how fast she would rise, but about whether she could still become what the world had predicted and beyond. In that silence, the question that followed her was no longer about potential, but about certainty. The expectations had not disappeared. They had only become heavier with time. What had once been a story of guaranteed rise had turned into a question mark over the future. The question was no longer whether she would become great. The question became whether she would ever become what everyone expected. After Rio, Sydney McLaughlin returned to a world that felt different from the one she had left. She had experienced the Olympic stage, but not the ending she had imagined, and now she was no longer the rising story of the moment. She went back to the daily grind of training and school, carrying the quiet weight of expectations that had not disappeared, only paused. In the years that followed, she continued her development through high school competition, refining her technique and learning how to manage pressure without the constant spotlight of the Olympics. The transition was not about instant redemption, but about rebuilding rhythm in an environment that no longer revolved around global attention. As she completed high school, she made the next major step in her journey by joining the University of Kentucky, entering the NCAA system, where competition was intense, structured, and unforgiving in a different way. For the first time, she was competing regularly against some of the best collegiate athletes in the United States, where talent alone was never enough to guarantee victory. College athletics forced her into a new kind of discipline. Training was no longer about potential or prediction. It was about execution, consistency, and learning how to win repeatedly under pressure. In this environment, she began to mature physically and technically, building strength, improving her hurdling rhythm, and refining the details that separate elite athletes from world champions. This period was not defined by dramatic headlines, but by steady internal development. She learned patience in a sport that often rewards only immediate results. Every race became part of a longer process, shaping not just her body, but her understanding of competition at the highest level. During her time at Kentucky, she continued to show elite-level performances, confirming that Rio had not defined her ceiling. Yet even with success, there was a growing realization that talent alone was not enough to dominate at the professional level. The margins were too small, and the competition too experienced for natural ability to carry everything. That understanding became the foundation of a major decision in her career. After competing at the collegiate level, she chose to turn professional, stepping away from the college system and committing fully to the pursuit of world-level excellence. It was a shift that signaled not just ambition, but seriousness about transforming potential into long-term dominance. Around this time, she began working with legendary coach Bobby Kersee, entering an environment known for producing some of the greatest athletes in track and field history. Under his guidance, her training became more focused, more demanding, and more strategic, emphasizing not just speed, but complete control of her event. This phase marked a deeper mental transformation. She was no longer simply the teenage prodigy who had reached the Olympics at 16. She was now building an identity as a professional athlete, someone who understood that greatness required repetition, resilience, and the ability to evolve through failure and expectation alike. Slowly, the version of Sydney that the world had first seen began to change. The raw talent was still there, but it was being shaped into something more complete, more controlled, and more dangerous for her competition, slowly taking shape. As Sydney McLaughlin continued her rise in the 400-meter hurdles, the landscape of the event was already defined by a dominant force. Dalilah Muhammad had established herself as the standard of excellence, combining speed, rhythm, and experience to control championship races with remarkable consistency. For any emerging athlete in the event, she was the reference point for what it meant to be world-class. Dalilah Muhammad was not just winning races, she was shaping the limits of the discipline itself. Her performances at the highest level, including Olympic and World Championship victories, created a benchmark that separated contenders from champions. For Sydney, this was no abstract comparison. It was the reality of every major final she entered. As Sydney progressed herself among the elite in the world, Her improvement was steady and undeniable. She was no longer the teenager trying to find her place, consistently finishing near the front in the most important races. But progress in elite sport is often measured in margins, and those margins were defined by one athlete who remained just ahead. In major finals, Sydney found herself repeatedly in close contention, but not in control of the outcome. She was fast enough to challenge, but not yet experienced enough to dominate. At the 2019 World Championships, that pattern reached a clear moment. Sydney ran one of the strongest races of her early professional career, finishing with a silver medal. It was a breakthrough result, confirming her place among the best in the world, but it also reinforced the reality that the top position was still occupied. In that same era, Dalilah Muhammad continued to push the boundaries of what was possible in the event, setting world record performances that redefined expectations once again. For Sydney, watching those performances was both inspiring and frustrating, because the standard she was chasing kept moving higher. This period became a psychological turning point. Competing at the highest level meant learning how to handle not just victory and defeat, but proximity to greatness. Being second was no longer about disappointment alone. It became a constant reminder of what still needed to be built. Through repeated high-level competition, Sydney began to understand something deeper about championship sport. Winning was not only about physical ability, it was about timing, control, and the ability to deliver under exact pressure when everything is on the line. That understanding slowly changed how she approached every race. Each encounter with Dalilah Muhammad became part of a longer education. Sydney was no longer simply chasing results. She was studying the mindset of a champion, learning how the best athlete in the world prepared, executed, and responded under Olympic-level pressure. In that space, Sydney's identity as an athlete began to shift again. She was no longer just a rising star trying to prove herself. She was now an athlete in pursuit of the standard itself, fully aware that greatness required more than talent and persistence. For years, she chased the best athlete in the world. Then everything changed. The turning point in Sydney McLaughlin's journey arrived at the United States Olympic trials in 2021, where she stepped onto the track not as a promising challenger, but as an athlete ready to redefine the event. The race itself carried a different kind of energy, where every stride suggested something extraordinary was about to unfold. In that final, she produced a historic performance, becoming the first woman in history to break the 52-second barrier in the 400-meter hurdles. The time did more than win the race. It announced a new level for the entire discipline, where what once felt impossible suddenly became reality. That moment changed the perception of her entirely. She was no longer simply competing with the best. She was now setting the standard they had to respond to. The athlete who had once struggled to reach an Olympic final had transformed into someone capable of rewriting the limits of the event. When she arrived in Tokyo for the Olympic Games, the narrative surrounding her had shifted completely. She was no longer the Olympic final in Tokyo became one of the most anticipated races in recent history. The world knew it would not just be a contest of speed, but a direct confrontation between the best athletes in the event, including Dalilah Muhammad, whose dominance had defined the previous era. From the start, the race unfolded at a pace that reflected its historic stakes. Sydney ran with precision and control, maintaining rhythm through each hurdle while staying fully composed under pressure. Every split suggested that something special was building, separated her from the field. The finish line came with a result that confirmed what the performance already suggested. The significance of this victory went far beyond a medal. It represented the complete transformation of an athlete who had once walked away from Rio without reaching a final. In Tokyo, she did not just compete with the world's best. She surpassed them in a way that redefined the event itself. Tokyo did not feel like the end of a journey. It felt like the beginning of something even larger. Most athletes spend their careers chasing a single moment like Tokyo. Sydney was only getting started. After Tokyo, Sydney McLaughlin entered a phase of her career that no longer looked like pursuit. It looked like control. At the World Championships in Eugene, she arrived not just as an Olympic champion, but as the athlete everyone else was now preparing to measure themselves against. The pressure had shifted direction. It was no longer about whether she could win, but how far ahead she would finish. In Eugene, she delivered performances that pushed the limits of the 400-meter hurdles even further. Each race was not simply a victory, it was a refinement of her own standards. standard, where she continued to reduce the time that once seemed untouchable. The event itself was being reshaped in real time by a single athlete operating at a level the sport had never seen before. As the season progressed, she achieved another historic milestone by becoming the first woman to run under 51 seconds in the event. This was no longer just breaking barriers, it was repeatedly rewriting them. The gap between her and the rest of the field was no longer measured in small margins. It had become visibly significant. In every major championship, the pattern became consistent. The race for second place remained competitive, but the race for first place had effectively been decided before the final hurdle. Her control of the event was not just physical, it was technical, mental, and tactical, all aligned in a way that left no real openings for challengers. Experts within the sport began to place her in conversations that extended beyond current competition. Her dominance was not being described in temporary terms. It was being compared to the greatest eras in track and field history, where athletes did not just win, but defined entire disciplines for years at a time. The foundation of this dominance was not only speed, it was technical mastery. Her stride pattern between hurdles, her rhythm maintenance under fatigue, and her ability to execute clean transitions under pressure became nearly flawless. What once required conscious control now looked automatic, as if the event itself had been internalized. Alongside this technical perfection came a shift in mentality. The uncertainty that once surrounded her early career had disappeared. In its place was a level of confidence built through repeated execution at the highest stage. She no longer approached races hoping to prove herself. She approached them expecting to deliver. This transformation changed how the entire event was perceived. The 400-meter hurdles was no longer seen as a wide-open championship race. It had become an arena shaped by one athlete's presence, where the focus was not only on who might win, but on how history might be rewritten once again. With each performance, Sydney McLaughlin was no longer responding to the sport was responding to her. The limits of what was considered possible continued to move, and she continued to move with them, or ahead of them, without hesitation. At this point, Sydney was no longer chasing history. History was struggling to keep up with her. Sydney McLaughlin's dominance in the 400-meter hurdles continued. Her life outside the track also began to take shape in a more personal direction. She married Andre Levrone Jr., entering a new chapter that brought stability and perspective beyond the intensity of competition. In a career defined by speed and pressure, this balance became an important part of her identity. Alongside her personal life, faith played a central role in how she viewed her journey. It became a grounding force that shaped her perspective on success, failure, and purpose. In a sport where athletes are often defined only by results, her outlook reflected something deeper than medals and records, offering a sense of direction beyond performance alone. Even at the peak of dominance, her career was not without challenges. Periods of injury and limited competition reminded her that even the most successful athletes must manage setbacks and uncertainty. These moments were not dramatic collapses, but quiet interruptions in a career that otherwise appeared almost untouchable. As her achievements continued to grow, so did the expectations surrounding her. Every new record raised the standard further, and maintaining that level of excellence became a challenge in itself, than reaching the top in the first place. The difficulty was no longer about chasing greatness, it was about sustaining it. When an athlete reaches a level where winning becomes expected, the pressure shifts from proving ability to defending identity. Every race becomes less about surprise and more about responsibility. For Sydney, this meant finding motivation in an environment where she had already achieved what most athletes spend entire careers pursuing. The question was no longer whether she could win, but how to continue finding purpose in repeated success at the highest level. This stage of her journey revealed a different kind of challenge, one that is rarely visible from the outside. Dominance does not eliminate pressure, it transforms it. The higher the standard she set, the heavier the expectation became to meet it again and again without decline. Yet even in this period, she remained at the center of her sport, continuing to represent the highest level of performance in the 400-meter hurdles. Her presence alone continued to define the event, even when she was not actively competing. As the next Olympic cycle approached, one question quietly returned beneath the surface of everything she had already achieved. A question that no record or title had fully answered. One final question remained. Could she prove that Tokyo was not the peak? As the Paris Olympic cycle arrived, Sydney McLaughlin Levrone entered it not as a rising talent, but as the defining figure of the 400-meter hurdles. Every race leading into the Games carried the expectation that if she competed, history might be rewritten once again. The focus was no longer on whether she would win, but on how far she could push the limits of the event. At the United States Olympic trials, she delivered another statement performance, breaking her own world record once again. It was a reminder that even after years of dominance, she was still capable of moving the standard forward. The barrier she had already shattered continued to fall further with each major appearance. When she arrived at the Paris Olympic final, the stage was set for another defining moment in her career. The race unfolded with the same control and precision that had become her trademark, but the result went beyond expectation. She stopped the clock at 50.37 seconds, setting yet another world record and producing one of the most commanding victories in Olympic track and field history. The margin of victory made the performance even more striking. She was not just ahead of the field, she was operating in a different category entirely, racing against the limits of the event itself rather than the athletes beside her. It was dominance expressed not through words or reputation, but through time on the clock. The contrast with Rio 2016 could not have been clearer. In Rio, she left the track without reaching a final, carrying questions about her future. In Paris, she stood alone at the center of her sport, having redefined what excellence looked like in the same event that once exposed her inexperience. The journey from that 16-year-old athlete to an Olympic champion and world record holder had not been linear. It had been shaped by expectation, disappointment, rebuilding, and complete transformation. Each phase of her career added another layer to a story that ultimately redefined the meaning of growth in elite sport. The final answer to the question that began this journey became clear not in a single race, but across years of evolution. The athlete who once fell short of the Olympic final did not fade under pressure. She returned stronger, more refined, and more dominant than anyone could have predicted. Rio did not stop Sydney McLaughlin. Rio created Sydney McLaughlin. The disappointment that once looked like failure became the foundation of one of the greatest athletic transformations ever witnessed.